Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman from Michigan. You hear her name, and, well, you probably have an opinion. Or you've heard some strong ones, anyway.
Definitely. She's a figure who really sparks debate.
Exactly. So today, we're going to try and dig into a question that seems to sit underneath a lot of that noise.
Mm.
Is Rashida Tlaib actually a threat to American democracy?
Yeah, it's a big question. And we've got some really interesting source material to look at. Different articles, different perspectives, some tracing her background, others looking at her policies.
Communication style?
Right. And pieces making the case, both for and against this idea of her being a threat.
So our mission then is to kind of unpack all that, look at the different arguments, try to understand the complexities here based on what these sources say.
Let's do it.
Okay, so where to start? Her background, maybe.
Makes sense. She was born in Detroit, grew up there. Her parents were Palestinian immigrants.
Working class background, right?
Yeah, very much so. And before politics, she was a social worker involved in community advocacy. Then she served in the Michigan State Legislature for, about 6 years?
Something like that, yeah. So it sounds like her roots are really in, representing everyday people in Detroit, dealing with local issues.
That's the picture painted, definitely. And it's interesting how people view that. Supporters will often point to it and say, look, this gives her authenticity, real-world experience, a perspective you don't always get in Washington.
Connected to the community.
Exactly. But then, on the flip side...
The critics say that activist background leads to a more confrontational style.
Yeah.
Less willing to compromise.
That's the argument. That maybe that approach, honed in advocacy, doesn't always translate smoothly to, legislative give and take.
And then came 2018, her election to Congress. Part of the squad.
Right. That felt like a big moment, a sort of signal of a new wave of progressive voices hitting the national stage.
Definitely a shift. Brought a lot of energy, a lot of focus on pretty ambitious policies, and maybe a willingness to challenge the Democratic Party itself, not just the Republicans.
Absolutely. Her election, alongside the others in the squad, really seemed to tap into a demand for a different kind of representation.
Okay, so that leads us nicely into her actual ideology. Her core progressive policies. There's a pattern there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Tackling big systemic issues.
Yeah, definitely. Take Medicare for all. That's a cornerstone.
She frames it as a human right, basically. Single-payer system, questioning the whole private insurance model.
And that fits into this broader progressive idea, right? That government should be directly involved in guaranteeing social well-being.
But the pushback is always about
cost, mostly, and feasibility. How disruptive would it be to the existing healthcare system? Lots of jobs tied up in that. That's the centrist or conservative concern you hear.
Then there's the Green New Deal. Another huge, ambitious plan.
Huge, massive government investment to fight climate change, but also trying to tie it to, job creation and economic renewal.
Addressing an existential threat, supporters would say.
But critics, again, they look at the scale, the cost. They worry it's maybe unrealistic, potentially damaging to certain industries, or might alienate voters who have other priorities.
Defund the police. That's another one that really ignites debate.
Oh, yeah. For Tlaib and supporters, it's about shifting resources, right? Taking money from traditional policing budgets and putting it into...
social services, mental health, housing, education. Things aimed at root causes of crime.
The logic being, prevention is better than reaction. Invest in communities, make them safer long term.
But the immediate reaction from many is concern about public safety. Right now.
Exactly. The fear that reducing police budgets, especially quickly, could lead to more crime. That's a really potent counter-argument for a lot of people.
Okay, and then her views on Palestinian rights. This is arguably where a lot of the most intense focus and controversy lies.
Without a doubt. She's extremely critical of Israeli government policies. She uses terms like occupation, apartheid, mentions the Nakba.
Which refers to the Palestinian displacement in 1948.
Right. And she supports the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Which is designed to pressure Israel economically and politically.
And this is where the accusations of anti-Semitism often come in, though she consistently pushes back, saying her focus is purely on human rights for Palestinians.
It's incredibly tangled, isn't it? International relations, human rights, domestic politics.
Absolutely. Her stance clearly resonates with those who see it as a justice issue. But it just as clearly draws fire from others who see it as unfairly targeting Israel, or worse, crossing a line into anti-Semitism itself. The language used is just so loaded.
Yeah. And finally, on the economic front, things like free college, $15 minimum wage, wealth taxes.
All aimed at tackling inequality, a sense that the economic system itself is fundamentally unfair and needs big adjustments.
Leveling the playing field, providing opportunity.
That's the goal. But critics worry about the impact on businesses, potential job losses, maybe capital flight, the standard economic counterarguments to those kinds of interventions.
So we have these policies. Now, how does she talk about them? Her communication style, it's often described as
Well,
blunt, direct.
Provocative sometimes. Yeah. I mean, the impeach the motherfucker comment right after she got elected.
That one definitely stuck, made headlines everywhere.
It really did, and it kind of captured something about her approach, didn't it? Energized her base, signaled zero compromise on Trump.
But also immediately drew criticism for being, unpresidential or uncivil, contributing to polarization.
Right. And it's not just isolated incidents. You see it in her tweets, her speeches.
Yeah.
She often frames issues in very stark moral terms, doesn't shy away from calling out opponents or even figures within her own party.
Like her criticisms of the Biden administration over Israel, for instance.
Exactly. And critics look at that style and worry. They say it erodes civility, makes compromise harder, maybe even damages trust in institutions if you're constantly framing opponents as morally wrong, not just mistaken.
But the flip side, from her supporters,
Is that she's speaking truth to power, cutting through the usual political niceties to call out injustice directly. They see that directness not as a flaw, but as a necessary tool.
a way to mobilize people, to push for the big changes they believe are needed.
Precisely. It raises that fundamental question about political communication. Is the goal consensus building, even if it means softening the message? Or is it uncompromising advocacy, even if it alienates some? Different philosophies at play.
Okay, so let's dig into the specific arguments from critics. Why do they see her as a potential threat to democratic norms? Polarization is a big one.
Yeah, the argument is that her policy stances themselves, like defunding the police or Medicare for all, are just so far from the center that they inevitably deepen the divides we already have.
Makes it harder to find common ground, harder to govern.
Right. And specifically on Palestinian rights, the language she uses, terms like apartheid or genocide, critics argue this really inflames tensions, fractures the Democratic coalition, and risks alienating key groups like Jewish American voters.
There's research showing how that kind of charged language can really amplify polarization.
And that connects to another point critics make, that she challenges institutional norms.
Yeah, the idea that her maybe willingness to defy party leadership or push for really sweeping reforms without maybe focusing on building broad consensus, that this could undermine the stability of the system.
Like prioritizing radical change over the traditional processes of compromise and incrementalism.
Kind of. There's a worry that it could erode trust in the institutions themselves if they're constantly being portrayed as obstacles or illegitimate. Think about things like debates over ending the filibuster or using executive action more assertively.
Okay. And then there's the really difficult issue, the allegations of anti-Semitism, which, as we said, mostly stem from her intense criticism of Israeli policies. The use of certain phrases is key here.
Like from the river to the sea, that led to her censure by the House.
Exactly. Critics hear that phrase and interpret it as a call to eliminate Israel. Her defenders, though, argue it's a call for freedom and equal rights for Palestinians living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, advocating coexistence.
It's a phrase with deeply contested meanings and histories.
Incredibly so. And critics will point to specific statements or past associations like the mention of her connection to Louis Farrakhan in one source and argue they cross a line, echo anti-Semitic tropes, or align her with problematic figures. Groups like the ADL have voiced these concerns.
While supporters often counter that these criticisms are weaponized.
Yes, that they're politically motivated attempts to shut down legitimate criticism of Israel and advocacy for Palestinians. It's a really complex and sensitive area, and understanding the different interpretations is crucial.
Okay, let's flip the coin now. The arguments for Tlaib, as someone who actually strengthens democracy, amplifying marginalized voices is a key one.
Absolutely. As the only Palestinian American in Congress right now, she brings a perspective that's just not widely represented.
Especially on Middle East issues.
Right. Supporters argue her focus on the human side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, her advocacy for Palestinian rights, provides a crucial counter-narrative in Washington. Some sources suggest her presence has genuinely shifted the conversation.
And they'd also point to her work protecting free speech, maybe, like opposing bills that could limit nonprofit advocacy.
Yeah, that's framed as defending fundamental democratic rights, the freedom to speak out, to organize, to petition the government. Some argued her censure itself was an attack on pluralism, on the idea that diverse, even challenging viewpoints should have a place.
Another argument is that she's pushing for systemic change that actually addresses democratic erosion.
The idea here is that things like massive economic inequality or lack of access to healthcare or education, these things weaken democracy because they make it harder for people to participate fully.
So advocating for policies like Medicare for all or free college isn't just about economics, it's about
Empowering citizens, strengthening the foundations of democracy by making society fairer. Some sources talk about the squad's mission being to sort of redeem the system by tackling these deep-rooted problems.
There was even a Hannah Arendt quote mentioned about diverse perspectives being vital.
Right, and her willingness to confront powerful interests like calling for investigations or resignation. Supporters see that as essential accountability in a democracy, holding power to account.
And finally, her supporters emphasize her resilience.
Yeah, they argue that the sheer volume and intensity of the criticism she faces, well, that it often goes beyond legitimate policy debate into personal attacks or deliberate distortions.
Politically motivated attempts to silence her, especially on Palestine.
That's the argument. They point to fact checks debunking certain claims about her views, and they see her persistence despite the attacks and even threats as a sign of her commitment to her principles and to democratic representation.
Okay, so synthesizing all this, threat or catalyst, it really feels like her whole approach pushes boundaries.
It really does. And whether that pushing is seen as dangerous or necessary seems to be the core disagreement.
There's no simple yes or no.
Definitely not. The risk of polarization is real. We see the data on partisan divides. But then again,
History shows that democratic progress often is disruptive, right? The civil rights movement, women's suffrage. They weren't exactly consensus-driven at the time.
exactly. They challenged norms, created division, but ultimately expanded democracy. So is Tlaib part of that tradition? Or is her approach fundamentally different, perhaps more damaging in the current climate?
It's also possible critics overstate her impact, or supporters underestimate the need for coalition building to actually get things done.
That's a fair point. And you see concerns cropping up, like one source mentioning worries about an anti-Zionist litmus test emerging in some progressive spaces, which adds another layer of complexity.
Her case really seems to crystallize some fundamental tensions in democracy itself.
It really does, that constant push and pull between reform and stability.
Between free speech and the desire for, a more civil discourse.
Between celebrating pluralism and needing some kind of national unity.
Her ideology forces conversations about topics maybe the mainstream would rather not confront head-on. Systemic inequality, U.S. foreign policy.
It definitely compels a reckoning. But there's always the risk of backlash, too. If a political movement is seen as too radical, it can sometimes provoke a reaction that sets back its own goals. We saw some discussion about that after the 2020 elections.
And you can't ignore identity, can you? The fact that she is a Palestinian American, a Muslim woman, that undoubtedly shapes the scrutiny she receives.
Absolutely. Some sources explicitly mention smear campaigns and argue that the attacks often leverage her identity in unfair ways, moving away from substantive debate.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's
Okay.
clear Rashida Tlaib, her ideology, her style, it's a really complex package.
Yeah. Whether you see her as a threat or a catalyst, it seems to depend heavily on your own framework, what you think democracy needs right now.
Does it need stability, incremental change, working within the existing lines?
Or does it need disruption? Does it need voices challenging the status quo, even if it's uncomfortable, to address what they see as deep injustices?
It really forces you, the listener, to think about the nature of our democracy today. How do we balance that need for change with the need for cohesion? It's not an easy question.
Not at all. Definitely something to keep mulling over. What's the right balance for a healthy, evolving democracy?